for folks that are interested, I'll put the playlist that we have in the chat. And usually it takes a couple hours after each of our sessions to kind of get it up on that playlist, but we found them to kind of be helpful on the governance end and have started doing it a little bit on the profiling end as well. The main topic of today is to really continue the conversation that we started 2 weeks ago, but really try to get through it on a practical standpoint, because one of the topics that we discussed in the last governance call was the fact that we had an exceeding amount of outstanding tickets that were kind of sitting in the graveyard, like things that we had discussed or reviewed or had been submitted and had been waiting there for a number of years, but that we really hadn't been able to kind of get through a decision on as part of our discussions. So in a kind of two-prong approach with both the profiling and the governance streams, trying to get through our issue logs so that we're actually getting the changes in that we've said are ready to be applied, and talking through how we get through some of the things that have been really, really sticky, because we haven't really had a solid approach or philosophy towards tackling some of these more challenging areas. And so I'm going to use real outstanding tickets, kind of like what we started at the very end of last call, to try to prompt some of these discussions with the goal of essentially where we land with these tickets, offering us a pattern to resolve very similar requests, because I've been kind of going through our issue log right before the call and noticing some really common patterns in what some of the ones that we haven't been able to get past even the triage phase look like. So we started doing this the last session, and we started to try to form a little bit of an opinion or position towards, how do we deal with some of the issues that tend to be asks for new artifacts. And we started with, I should say extension actually. We started with one of our oldest ones that effectively was around asking to socialize a new extension for a value set. And I think at the time we were operating under the assumption that the value set that was being requested in addition to the extension was net new. And so it's important to raise, because I think Rita, I think she's on, had done a little bit more investigation between now and the last profiling call, and it changes the equation slightly. And I see someone's got their hand up. Lorraine, go ahead. You are on mute.
Sorry. Just remind us what CHDCF stands for.
Oh, it's the Pan-Canadian Health Data Framework. So it's effectively, it's the information model that will be
that Kaha is working on. Okay. Yeah. It's just, I don't think it was necessarily immediately obvious.
Got it. So let's say model that will inform the CA core. And the idea is, the reason I framed this here is because ultimately the idea is that when we start making decisions about what are things that we actually do think are in scope for things that we can tackle and what may be more appropriately tackled upstream, we should be doing so under the context that there are active there's active work in play to examine things like, should we be moving towards a different value set? Should we be doing better practices in the population of certain elements or population of elements that haven't been done to date? That this work is kind of happening, and the intent is to kind of filter down, but we didn't have all of these details when we first started kind of scoping out the survey baseline. So I think it merits kind of thinking through, are there some of these that we can resolve by trying to channel upwards if we haven't felt like we can resolve it internally to date? So we looked at the, and I'll put it in the chat, we looked at an extension request that was really old last time, and I'll make that available for you folks. We thought it was a really good, nice, clean case, right? It's like, our stance was, we want to reduce duplication of extensions. And, on requests that we have for new extensions, ultimately, we won't consider those in the scope of development. And instead try to rate them towards teams like the teams that are working on information models to try to incorporate that way so that they do end up filtering down. And that potentially an extension is developed upstream as opposed to like us creating it because nothing else exists. So that was the stance that we took 14 days ago. And I think part of that is driven by the fact that it's a net new extension and it isn't being utilized in the community. And part of it was also from considerations that there may not be an existing like anchor to tie this to. So Rita had done some homework for us. Thank you, Rita. And essentially just said, we have this extension on ethnicity today. The ask was to develop an extension for a racialized group, and that there was, in fact, an established value set for this terminology. And so I think it merits kind of a breakdown and trying to consider how we deal with this pattern in the future. And so my ask on the governance call is that, even if there's best practices in place and there is a value set, Joni, you might want to mute. I'm getting a lot of background noise. Is there a consistent approach that we want to take? Does this still hold? Right? Which is, it's not in our scope to develop net new extensions. And maybe I'll add a little bit more flavor to this, and then I will come back and actually ask you folks. So keep that in your mind and start thinking through that. So this was an ask on the patient resource, the patient profile, I should say. The patient profile to date has extensions that, oh, I hate this view, that were created for ethnicity. And this was created at the time. You can actually see this is a true CA baseline generated ethnicity extension. It was modeled after what was in US core in terms of like the structure, but the binding that is preferred was set towards ethnicity code, which maps to a value set in the terminology gateway. So essentially in the past, we have had precedent for creating this extension. When we had a value set, does that change our opinion towards net new extensions and our scope towards consideration of this type of request?
Whew. Thinking out loud.
Please.
I think the ethnicity one, particularly from what's in US core, is a bit loaded as an example. But there may be places where that's exactly what we want to do. Extensions around the GSSO stuff, as an example, if we can't backport from R5, that might be an example that we decide we want to do. But I think we do need to consider carefully before we add them.
Can you describe the example you provided, Lorraine, just really quickly, the backporting piece, where it's like it might be a good
for instance,
exception?
So there's an extension in R5 that expands on what was in R4 around expressing gender identity.
Yep.
And if we find we can't backport it and we want to model the same extension, that's a decision we could make. But I think we want to be really careful about when and where we choose to add extensions in the baseline. But there may be some use cases where it's important enough that we choose to do it.
Vinny, I saw you go off mute.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of at that time, Kai was working on doing analysis on racialized group and ethnicity and whatnot. I see Shannon and Joni. I'm not sure if Joni has started. I think Joni has started with Kai. So I don't know if Shannon is able to speak in terms of what has happened in that work. I know at that time it was getting close to being finalized in terms of the racialized concepts, but ethnicity, I think, is still in the process of being explored. So, as far as Kai is concerned at that time, it was more interested in racialized group rather than ethnicity.
That's
But
still
at
the
least,
case, Finny. It's kind of sad actually at how little things have changed. So yes, we do have a standard for racialized group, and work is still ongoing on the ethnicity concept, but the framework will leverage that work. And I would say the same goes for the GSSO concepts as well.
so essentially, ethnicity is not the same as racialized groups. So
Correct.
that's my understanding. So
Yeah,
I don't
and
know
that was
if
part of my point, was that the US concept of ethnicity and what we're considering racialized group are different things. And we sometimes we want to be careful about picking things up from US core.
I agree 100%.
So in the case where this is being the original request, which is, can there be an extension that utilizes this value set for racialized group? The value set exists and it is being considered for the PCH DCF. Is there a risk in us creating this extension now while these items are still being, like, could potentially evolve?
So one of the questions is around that is, what's the risk of creating an extension that's not a must, because we're not talking about must understand extensions.
Yep.
Right? We're just talking about extensions that are available. What's the downside of having one?
Yeah. So maybe just we could double check in terms of what's happening internationally, in terms of HL7 in defining ethnicity or racialized group or whatnot. But my understanding from SNOMED CT is they're leaving it at the national level to define what those values are. They're not defining an international
Yes,
set.
but answering Sheridan's question about should be providing extensions while these things are still evolving. What's the downside of providing an extension? So I guess there's two things. How many people might need to use it?
Yep.
And if we create something that's still evolving, it's in the extension space, is there a downside? I'm not sure there is, but that's what I think we should think through.
So lastly, we talked about duplication and potentially uncertainty around expectations for use. So I'm gonna add that and then continue on.
Okay, yes, because in terms of the baseline, I guess some of that is what are our expectations around the baseline and any extensions that the baseline defines.
So just to clarify, the actual value set might evolve, but the concept between the distinction between ethnicity and racialized group are two different things. So it's not like they're going to merge into one. So if we create an extension for racialized group, I don't think it's wrong for us to do that because it's a separate concept from ethnicity. The value set might evolve, but it's not going to go away.
Yes, but the question comes down to, when do we choose to create an extension, and what are the use cases that drive us there, I think, is where we're trying to get to.
So I'll leave that with Kai to speak in terms of priority and whatnot.
I don't think that's Kai-Hi's choice, is it? In terms of the baseline?
No, but they would have a lot more information on, like, conditions of use, how folks, like, as a concepts that have been developed.
Oh yeah,
with
they've got
FHIR
lots of
originally,
input,
yeah.
but the decision we make about when we create an extension based on a use case in the baseline, I think is probably this group's decision, is it not?
Well,
Yeah,
that would be driven by use case, right? And priority.
Yeah, and when I think about something like GSSO, like I think some of those concepts are not sort of slotted for the first release of the framework. So we're talking like a ways out, probably before.
Oh, frankly, the projects that I've been involved in are going to deal with GSSO like almost imminently
Right.
because
So
there's
maybe that's a good
demand.
example of something that should be done sooner rather than later.
Yeah, there's demand in the community to sort that all out.
I
Particularly
would
now
be
that
worried
agenda.
about like putting something like that off, waiting for the framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So my point was, I don't know if there's a downside of creating an extension. If we were going to change the base profile, that's a whole different thing. But creating an extension to figure out how we're going to deal with things in the interim.
what about maintenance over time with changes? And this is a
Well,
little bit of a,
yeah, maintenance is always an issue. You're right.
so this is an outstanding ticket that we haven't been able to solve that had to do with our ethnicity extension. So there was an established value set. We created an extension to house that value set. And when we heard feedback from implementers that codes that we were exposing through the extension were no longer actually, I think, active in SNOMED anymore, there was a challenge in that, like, we really weren't the maintainers of the value set, and that we were just trying to fill a gap that existed in the community for how you would represent this. But we were the first door that people with problems walked through. So there is, I think, a maintenance consideration in this.
There is. I mean, it's a maintenance process because this isn't really any different than the fact that the baseline community is not officially responsible for maintaining the naming systems.
Yeah.
But the topic came up here because you were the first door. We do need to have a group that's responsible for maintaining our value sets. So I agree there's a maintenance issue here, but I don't think it's our issue. I think it's something that needs to be kicked upstairs slightly.
So if we had
health terminologies group,
that's actually, I think, who is formally chartered with that responsibility.
So assuming that that process works, in that when we get so there is still a risk, because it is a risk of increased burden. While it may not land in under our responsibility to do maintenance, it still adds some portion of extra steps to do the handoff. So we'll keep it as a risk, but note, there are kind of ways to kind of reduce it. Are there other, I think Elliot brought up this duplication, which is if, for instance, an extension is made for racialized group, for instance, in the CA core, like, will it create confusion, and also like confusion around which URL do I use? What's the canonical URL I claim under my extension? Or challenges if we have it in the CA baseline and then migrate it over to CA core, and folks have been using this URL and now have to change that URL in their configurations.
That is a challenge.
What do folks think? Like, is that how weighty, how well weighted against the benefit is that challenge? Is anyone using the ethnicity extension URL in their implementation today?
I'd have to actually have to check the BC profiles. I don't remember.
Yeah, because I think like that, how significant would the change be? I mean, we could kind of try to ascertain that against an existing one.
I think the value sets were challenging.
Honestly, as far as I know, we weren't even allowed anything.
Yeah, I think BC is not using as well, I think, at this point. Ethnicity. Yeah.
And Randy, you cut off a little bit. You said you don't think you're using the ethnicity
I
extension.
don't think we're even allowed to be using.
Mm. So with what we've heard to date, are there additional risks that we need to consider before we talk about this comparison against the benefit and our decision about net new extensions kind of at whole?
Well, I think that overall decision about net new extensions is slightly abstracted a level up from what we're talking about on this particular extension.
How do we get to that discussion, Lorraine? Like, is it, so we've got an example here. The example has some conditions around the fact that it will likely show up in the CA core. Is it that what extensions that we think won't show up in CA core are what helps us to get to that abstracted answer?
I actually think it's in terms of, so the two questions are, what's the downside of creating it? And do we need to create it to support current implementation work in terms of net new extensions? You know, and that I'll come back to the GSSO example. Yes, that's probably going to end up in the CA core and in the whatever that alphabet soup of acronym was. But people are needing to deal with it now. So if we come up with a way to direct people how to deal with it now as we move to what the longer term solution is, that's a driver of creating a net new extension. It's probably not the only one, and might not be decisive in terms of the decision.
How common is this going, like, so the GSSO example, there's kind of this outstanding question of like, will we be able to backport it? But are there other ones that we think would fall into this bucket of this is really critical? It's not an extension that people are using today, but we think that they will need it? Or is this kind of the one-off?
I have the sense that it's not hugely common, but it's possible in other instances, but I don't really have any data to back up that assertion.
Because my thinking was always like, if someone needed it, we'd actually find out usually to start because they'd put it in their guide. They'd make an extension, we'd have something to reference. But in most of the cases, you know, when we go to determine whether or not we should socialize something, our decisions have been around things that already exist.
Well, and I think we are all putting extensions in our guides. The question is, should they be common or not?
Mm-hmm. So putting the GSSO one aside for a second, because you know there are ways if we're talking about backporting an existing extension, like there are ways you could preempt that, right? You could put out a CA core extension that is literally just what's in gender harmony. If you knew you were going to use it and you just knew had to do the conversion between R5 and R4, and that's why you were recreating it. I think that's probably something that could be
okay. So trying to come up with another example. on practitioner, BC has an extension that includes license conditions that the college might have assessed on a given practitioner. There isn't any way to document that in the core FHIR. So there's an extension to cover those license conditions that we have. That may or may not be something that is across Canada is a common use case, but it could be an example that we might end up choosing that, yeah, we want to do that. I don't know.
Would there be a reason for doing it in the baseline, aside doing the baseline before waiting for it to get into CA core?
Well, the reason to doing it in the baseline would be that it's a common use case for most of us across the country.
Yeah.
I don't know how to assess that.
So are we trying to come up with principles on sort of filters before we decide to add an extension? Is that what we're trying to do here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
we're
think-
trying to,
go
yeah.
ahead.
I was gonna say, we're trying to decide what the criteria are that where we would add a new extension to the baseline. And
Yeah.
so I was
Okay.
trying to come up with examples of extensions that exist and how we would decide.
So are there not principles in internationally that FHIR use right now to decide which extensions go?
No,
So we're coming up with new principles here. Is that what we're
Mhm.
saying?
For how to operate as a national base. I think
Okay.
that's the yeah, under the conditions we're also experiencing, which is a soon to be, additional supplemental national core.
So would one of the criteria be number of jurisdictions that are requesting or would be needing? That would be one filter, right? So if it's 2 or more, we add it to the baseline.
I think that's a potential criteria. I think we still have to assess it against this risk, right? Which
sorry,
is
I need to read what when you say this risk.
the risk of duplication, potentially having them live in the core, like eventually, and then making our implementers make that change,
Yeah.
and creating that uncertainty and confusion. Because I think that the stance we took kind of initially under like a very clear cut, which is like, we're not going to do net new. But I think we also have the question of like, what do we do about ethnicity now? If we said we aren't going to do net new because all these reasons exist, what does that mean for the things that we've created in the past? But if we break it down, like, do we think that this statement, which is, it's not in scope for us to, we'll not socialize, we socialize existing extensions and will not, it's not in our scope to develop net new extensions for these purposes, right? That this is still true for racialized group. And like, when we come across another one of these requests, we can use some of these criteria to, I hate that, to make that determination of like, do we
Story
apply that
shared.
same?
Can we go back to that principle, to that idea of we are not adding or something like that?
Yep. So let me actually pull it up here and I'll expand it. So this was the original text. We'll socialize extensions that exist and are not we're not in scoped for developing new extensions.
And why is that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I have questions about the basis for that decision.
Yeah, so this was what we wrote on the 13th in this ticket. We wrote it on the call. So
Yeah, I
we
was traveling 13th, so I missed.
Okay,
So
got it. Okay, so we talked about the reasons for not creating a net new extension. So concerns about having multiple kind of versions with differing URLs that are duplicated across places or that may become out of sync over time and create confusion, but through implementers about what you actually use. Being a driver for why at this point in time we wouldn't create a new extension, particularly if we expected it would show up in the core.
well, but if we have something that people need now, is it not worse to have 13 different versions of extension in jurisdictional iGuides?
Well, for this one, do we think that people need it now?
So that might be another criteria. How soon is the need?
Yes.
I don't know what is happening, but apparently this thing hates me. Okay.
Because our goal is interoperability, right? So we don't want people to be creating all sorts of extensions.
Correct. So if it's just a local requirement, then it's a local requirement, job done. But if it's something that's common across the country, that's a different question. And saying that we won't create a new one if we have a common need, I think might be a step too far. I think we want to be careful about creating something new and make sure there's a driving use case and a common need. But I don't think we would say we wouldn't create a new thing.
I think I would understand the intent to be that we're not going to create one unless somebody actually demonstrated for it, rather than just building it.
Yeah, I'd agree that if we're going to create something new, we need a clear use case and we need a need across more than one jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Does that capture what you're saying?
Yeah, I support that.
So would that be something that's appropriate for, like, there's going to be a governance structure as part of the Pan-Canadian Data Health Content Framework? Would that be something that would be valuable to bubble up to them to get that provincial buy-in from various jurisdictions?
Potentially. Although I don't think that should necessarily be decisive on the baseline, particularly while we're still in the development stage.
So let's say we get this request from the community. Johnny, I think this might be what you mean. If we get a request to say, hey, we just got a request, but we don't know how to assess it. We got a request from one person. How do we assess with folks that are maybe already been discussing similar concepts with jurisdictions and use that evidence to make the determination? Is that what you're saying, Joni?
Yeah, basically, if we get a request, I mean, if we've already got a governance table because it's being set up, if we've got a governance table that has representation from all of the provinces and territories, and we get a request from one person or even a couple of people, I think it would be appropriate to bring that to the larger group and say, hey, we've got this request. What do we think?
Agree, as long as that larger table is accessible.
And so is the point of that to assess, like, to determine, oh, this is kind of already in scope, it's going to be incorporated, or will help us assess if it's actually like something that is common?
Yeah, I think
it would help us determine, if it's common enough for, general implementation.
I think it's not a lot different from, I'm watching the time for my next meeting, lots of time. I think it's not a lot different from when we went to the implementers group around OIDR naming system changes, to see if, when we got a new OID request, if that OID request was a something was already covered and they should use an existing one, or was truly net new, etc. We went to the community and asked. And I think going to the community and asking is appropriate. The question is, what are the forums that we should ask in? I think that's what you're bringing up, Joni.
Yeah.
I
I
think
find that there's not a whole lot of engagement on Info Central at the moment.
So
There's some,
but any of the forums we go to need to be open and accessible, even if people don't choose to access them, right? Whatever forum we ask the question in and make the decision in needs to be open.
So is there going to be a forum?
I'm not sure who's whether it's Kai or Infoway or the two of them setting up all the governance. And I'm not sure where they are in that process where we are in that process right now.
Yeah,
I can speak to that at a high level. It's definitely both of us. Like we're working through the governance of the framework as a whole right now. And I will say the Info Central working groups are featured in the model that we're looking at right now, but it's very much a work in progress. Like we're literally working on it as I speak.
Well, and the data framework is somewhat a level sitting above where we are with baseline.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. And so decisions about the baseline need to be informed by what's going on with the framework and what's going on with CA Core Plus and what's going on with all of that. But the community could still make a decision saying, yeah, we know the framework is working on this. We want to align with them. But while we wait for that to be finished, this is what we're going to do. Right? So that's still possible.
If the need was so pressing, I think that's the part where I'm really struggling here. Because when I put this against the racialized group extension, I'm like, if we had 3 people who were batting down our doors and saying, I needed this yesterday, then it makes sense to say, listen, we've heard this. We need something in place to prevent them from making just extensions of their own. We want to inform and keep like the framework in the loop. But this is one where, like, I don't know, it's 3 years old. I'm not hearing people, I mean, unless I'm misreading it and people on the call are like, we really needed this. I'm not hearing folks battening down the doors for this. And so all I'm seeing is risk. If this is something that could wait, if racialized group could wait for 6 months to have an extension in the core. Like,
oh, I agree with you for that particular extension. I think now I'm gonna dive riskily into my own opinion. I think we went into ethnicity because US Core had an ethnicity. I don't know that we went there because we needed it. So I agree with you. I actually haven't heard a need at this stage. Now, if we hear a need, I would change my opinion.
Yeah. So what I did is actually I took this out of the ticket and I'm seeing all my spelling mistakes. Yay. And so like, because this is more applied for process, whereas I think we need to kind of talk about this in the context of the ticket too. So we talked about, is it an existing extension? No. Is there a clear use case? Maybe. How soon is the need? I think I'm not hearing anyone say that it's really, really pressing. And how prevalent, still TBD. It may be more prevalent in the future, but I think the how soon is the need probably preempts that. So if I bring that back to my ticket and I'm going to, oh my gosh, pull my hair out. There. Okay, so if I bring this back, do we think that this is still true, that maybe we modify this language and we bring out our criteria more? So it's...
Yeah, because I'm thinking we're not saying we would never create a new extension. It's that we would only create a new extension under the conditions that you just enunciated.
Um, across more than, I'm just gonna say more than two, because it's really more, well, I'm gonna say more than one, because we know that. And we'll this extension request does not currently meet the criteria of it being a pressing need, and therefore tell me if there's parts of this. I will stop and reread it together, but if there's parts that you want to edit while we work through this. Will not develop this new extension.
I don't know how to say it, but maybe one of the features is how far out it is on the health data framework timeline or the CA core timeline, like how long it is before they're going to be dealing with it.
But if that answer is 3 months or 13, does that reduce the risk of the whole configure against one canonical URL, then change it? Like if you know it's coming.
If you know it's coming, but if it's 36 months rather than 13, that might change the assessment.
What do folks think?
I think that really comes into.
Oh, Randy, you cut out. What was that?
I think that comes into effect when you're considering how many people are looking to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we still only have one person looking for it and it's 3 years out, we're probably better off waiting. But if we got 12 looking to do it, then we probably need to get an answer now, so to bridge the
Mhm.
gap.
I think that all of those criteria sort of have different weights against the decision, but they're all in play.
So maybe we try this with another example to determine, like, is this one that would have a slightly different criteria because it is a more pressing need. I think Vinny, you had said kind of not on your end, like, are you pushing for the resolution? But we think based on the fact that it's likely going to be in the framework that this is likely still a need. So I think our folks are comfortable with the way this is worded. We'll update the ticket here. And
When you say this is still need, what this are you talking about?
to represent racialized group in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I'm assuming that based on the comment earlier about it being like incorporated into the framework as a concept. All right.
Again, I will let Shannon speak about in terms of which jurisdictions have already implemented those concepts. but whether they're sharing it through FHIR or whatnot, it may not, it may be another story, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, they may already be capturing those, but they're not necessarily exchanging it through FHIR. So maybe that's another criteria. I don't know.
Well, Mukesh, you could probably speak to this, but I think I know that the value set, for instance, in HSIM and PLR for ethnicities, when you get particularly into the indigenous ethnicities, is way more detailed than the
Yes.
national value set is.
Correct. The original indicator, I guess that is the one was discussed in past, and I guess that is the kind of extension I think we will be having in our profile. So it's going to be part of ethnicity.
Yeah.
So that is, yes, we do have. So I think I don't mind we discuss maybe we can use extension, but it is a good point when we're talking about ethnicity. If we can capture it the same. Yeah.
So I actually would like to talk about ethnicity. Are folks comfortable with the modification where it's like, we're still landing in the same place with racialized groups? We will close this out. Our next step is to raise that, hey, this is likely an extension that will continue to be needed. It will have to be reflected in CA core, but that ultimately in CA baseline right now, there isn't a pressing need to create it, and that extension can be created upstream, I should say. Anyone uncomfortable with this before we talk about ethnicity? Okay. All right. So then the next piece. So we talked about racialized group. Then with ethnicity. So there was a couple different asks when I went through to deal with ethnicity. Both around the need for an extension. I think Ken originally raised it more like we need to determine whether we're going to do this or not, and if we're going to do it, what value set. So some of this may already be in place, but I want to just frame it in terms of the this is an extension that already exists in the CA baseline. You know, we had folks that had thoughts on what should go kind of into the value sets. It was a value set that was developed in Terminology Gateway. Do we think that these types of like extensions as they exist today, hearing that they may not be in use for FHIR exchange by the folks on the call, that it makes sense to maintain the extension that we've developed? So if nobody's using it now, but they could use it in the future, does it make sense to pull it and try to republish under CA base or CA core in hopes that that is what the stable, like where it will live in stability and maintenance?
I guess one of the questions is, how do we decide what's in baseline versus core?
Yep.
And is it common enough to be in baseline, or is it more use case specific enough that it ends up in core?
How do you determine that with like ethnicity? It's a
Oh,
demographics component.
I think the answer for the ethnicity may be that it's baseline, but when you ask the question, I think that's the decision we're making. How do we decide what we want in baseline versus what ends up in core?
I was kind of surprised to hear that even though we've had this for 2 years, nobody's used it. I mean, one of the things we can do is ask.
Yeah, we can ask, but I frankly think we might have included it just because US Core does.
So do folks think that like the way to get through this type of ticket where we have questions about whether or not there is this kind of broad scale usefulness because it hasn't been used to date, that the process is, you know, we ask on the call, which we've done. I think we've heard three no's. We put it out on the FHIR implementers group, and hearing that nobody is using it, we make the decision in the next call. If we hear that nobody's using it, either way, we discuss it in the next call. And if no one is using it, decide to remove it and more so push it upwards to the framework so that it could be incorporated in core should folks actually need to use it.
Well, and I think the corollary question is it's a two-part question. Are people using it? The answer is no, it's not a big deal. But if we get an answer that yes is back, is the value set appropriate?
Let's talk about that. Is it, if they say yes, as in they're using the one that is established with this value set, do we think it's our scope to determine what the appropriate value set is if this is not it?
I think if
Doesn't
we're
the fact
go ahead,
doesn't the
Elliot.
fact that they're using it indicate that the value set is working for them? So there may be some out there who are saying, no, we're not using it because the value set doesn't work for us.
Yes. Well, I think I'm not sure. I don't remember what the binding is. I think we're probably binding at least with the ability to provide additional codes. But I do think that in terms of principles, when we're creating structures, whether it's extension or a specific profile, and choosing a value set, it is up to us to determine the appropriate value sets. I don't think that's something we can pass off when we're creating either an extension or a profile, you know, as a baseline community.
What do others think?
I would say realistically, that comes more under like the terminology group stuff.
Well, it does, but we have to choose what we bind to. They may need to create or edit it, but we still have to choose what we bind to and what's appropriate in our information structures, correct?
Yes, keep it as
Choosing what's
example.
in that list shouldn't be something. Should be something.
And actually, and the binding strength. Sorry, Randy, go ahead.
I'm saying that choosing what's in that list of values there shouldn't be us because that's more of a terminology related thing in itself.
You're cutting off, Randy.
That's unlikely we would ever be able to.
Brian, did you want to put it, you were just cutting off there. You want to put it in the chat?
So I was just refamiliarizing myself between baseline and core. So if my understanding is correct, baseline is the most open, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then the core is you constrain it and eventually implementation guide. So we want to have the baseline to be a superset, right? So we want concepts there that you know, potentially would be used, such as ethnicity, racialized group, and other things. And then the core will be what it is that we want to be more constrained. Is that correct? Is that is my understanding correct?
I think the constraint scale is correct, but we have typically kept our what do we include set at things that are existing in implementations in Canada. So it's not calling it a superset in that sense doesn't always work with things like extensions.
So if we have extensions that are used in jurisdictions, it may not necessarily go to the baseline, but it would go to the core.
Potentially, like if there was one, like I think the point that Lorraine was making was like if there is a particular use, like a use case where those demographics are particularly important and it comes out of something like patient summary or e-referral or you know, acute care, that that's something that would have more merit in application and constraint in a core. But if
So-
we're not seeing it in use to date, we can't make the argument that it's used broadly and therefore should be socialized.
So it may not necessarily be in the core, but should it not be in the baseline?
I think in some cases baseline should be broader.
That's what I'm
and less
thinking.
restrictive.
Yeah, I think
Um,
it doesn't need to be a strict superset. I think
Mhm.
it's these are the ideas that are broadly applicable for most use cases. So there may be extensions that are only narrowly applicable, so they aren't going to make it into baseline.
And as we get to value sets, we may say in the baseline, if we go back to ethnicity, the value set that comes from the terminology gateway is the preferred for the baseline, but there might be local cases that extend that or replace it, right? So we might bind something really loosely so we have some guidance for people, but that doesn't mean it's strict.
So in this case, I still think we have to answer the first question, which is it even in use? Like, are people utilizing this? And I think we can do that between now and their next governance call. I think we can ask, like, put it out, put it on FHIR implementers. Are people using the ethnicity extension use case? Maybe we'll put something to Elliot's point of like, if you aren't, is there a reason you're not? To kind of explore that. Because I think if this isn't true, I think we have it's like the other component that we talked about before, where it's like it's almost like it's a precedent in our decision tree. So why don't we start with that, and then we can come back to what we find, and if we do find it is in use, how we tackle that. Is it appropriate?
So that's an
Yeah.
interesting thing that Randy put on the chat.
Oh, about baseline being renamed core. I think we'd have to explore that more with Attila. It might be a shorthand way of saying we're able to use the baseline as the start of the core, but I think there is intended to be a distinct difference between a base and a core. And the thing that we have to manage is making sure that, you know, if we decide to continue on and have a base, then we have to find a way of keeping in sync with the core and not introduce additional risks like duplication of extensions and differences in value sets, etc.
Another example that's going to come up and be pertinent, which we haven't really talked about yet, is a number of jurisdictions are trying to figure out how they manage the association and rosters and panels between patients and providers, and what extensions are necessary to provide the information on those linkages. So there's definitely use cases coming up that we're probably going to have to figure out how to deal with. So that was why I reacted to that. We don't create anything new. Right? I think the criteria you documented are appropriate criteria. But I think that we might come across needs in the not too distant future that meet those criteria.
Okay. All right. So we're gonna keep it open. I'll probably update it to like awaiting community feedback and put that ask out. We'll return to this particular topic and then return to that question of, you know, how do we start talking about whether or not it is appropriate if it is in use? All right. I am going to end the recording, and I think I'll see many of you, I think, at the next profiling call if it's on the 3rd.